Welcome to the Global News Podcast from the BBC. Hello, I'm Ankur Desai, and today alongside me, I've got Daniel Bush, our correspondent from Washington. Daniel, how's it going? Busy day for you so far?
Always busy, Ankur. I'm sure for you too.
I found this particular story we're going to discuss today quite interesting because so much of the focus at the moment in Washington, I can imagine, on Iran, the Middle East, and the conflict that is unfolding on a day-to-day basis. However, a story which has flown under the radar a little bit are the tariffs that Donald Trump's administration are going to have to refund.
That's right. So I'm so glad that we're shining a spotlight on this story because you're right. So much attention here is in Washington is focused on the war with Iran. But this is a very big deal. This has, enormous implications for the U.S. economy, for the global economy, for President Trump's second term, for the fight, the power struggle between the branches of government here in the U.S. So there's a lot to dig into. Just a quick, broad overview. If we think back to last year when Trump famously appeared in the Rose Garden with that big poster board that everyone remembers with the tariffs for each country. Those were his so-called global tariffs. And he put these sweeping tariffs into place on all imported goods to the United States from all countries, everywhere in the world, with different levels for different nations, different for China, for India, for Canada, with some of the United States' longest standing trading partners. They were all hit with tariffs. It caused a huge uproar. We remember that period in March, April, May of last year where, the tariffs were on, they were off, he would move them up, he would threaten to move them down. But they went into effect. I mean, that's the long and the short run, right? They went into effect and the U.S. government began collecting duties, taxes on imported goods. And the Supreme Court just ruled a little while ago this year, the power in the United States to levy tariffs, to levy taxes on imports rests with Congress, not with the executive branch, not with the president. And so it ordered Trump to undo those tariffs, number one, and also as a result to pay them back. So that's where we stand. And just this week, for the first time, the administration has begun the process of figuring out how to pay back what the Supreme Court has said was illegally taken taxes to the tune of $166 or so billion.
I mean that's
a huge
incredible.
amount of money.
Sorry, that's incredible. $166 billion. It's not like you can just suddenly turn up with the receipt and say, hi, I'd like $166 billion transferred into an account, and then that sort of gets sent off to different people who are owed different sums of money. How does that even begin to process?
That's right. I mean, this is a logistical headache for the administration, but also for companies. I mean, let's remember, these are companies ranging from huge multinational corporations to small mom and pop shops, as we call them here in the U.S., that may have imported, goods to manufacture, a small hardware product,
Right.
a cloth for T-shirts, any good.
It could be a local bike shop getting some products in from, I don't know, South Korea or Japan, but you could also be looking at a big global company like Costco or FedEx, right?
Correct. Everything from, a box that with nuts and bolts, literal nuts and bolts that was shipped to a small business owner to a shipping container containing thousands of components that, a big multinational corporation imported to the United States. So all of these companies now have an opportunity to get back the money that they paid. So let's think about how that's going to work. And I've been speaking with trade experts ahead of this to understand the process better. So over 330,000 importers paid these tariffs that the Supreme Court struck down, over 330,000. Of those, only 17% so far are enrolled and deemed eligible by the government to get the refunds. So you might say, well, 70% that's a low number, but they actually account for 82% of all the taxes that were collected. So some 127 billion of that $166 billion total is from a small group of businesses, and I'm told those are the big companies, your major corporations who are constantly importing goods from abroad. They account for the vast majority of the taxes, and they're now in the process of trying to get those back from Customs and Border Patrol, the agency that was responsible for collecting the taxes in the first place. It's a complicated process, Ankur, for how you do that. I've been told it's not just simply a matter of, a small business owner or a big company just sort of sitting down in front of a computer and spending a couple hours filling out forms.
Right.
And because it's so complicated and because in certain circumstances you have to hire attorneys to work through your receipts and so on, it may turn out that it's simply not worth it for these small businesses that are being left behind.
Okay, so naturally, a lot of companies, well, they will have to pay more in tariffs. They have been paying a lot more in tariffs, and they've then had to pass on this cost to consumers, customers, American citizens. Are they going to see any of that money back? The U.S. Treasury have said no.
Right. I mean, that's the big question. We've been talking about companies, right? So now let's shift a little bit and talk on the consumer end. Um, First off, we know that since these tariffs have gone into effect, that cost has been passed to consumers, right? President Trump last year said, these tariffs are going to make America strong again. They're going to, end an era of companies cheating the U.S. They're going to help rebuild the economy. I mean, these tariffs were a core part of his platform, his economic platform, and he has argued all along that it's not going to hit consumers, is not going to hurt, average everyday Americans paying for groceries, paying for gas, paying for hardware to renovate a home, and so on. But in fact, that's exactly what happened, right? So as these tariffs went into effect, the price of goods went up. And now the question is, will that continue? And honestly, I think it's just a little too early to say because before companies decide whether or not to continue to pass on those high costs, they need to see first what their refunds are going to be, right? So maybe that in some cases, companies will decide, well, we got back all of our refunds. Maybe we'll lower prices a little bit to try and be competitive in the marketplace. But probably what I'm told by trade experts is that often doesn't happen. Once companies
Yeah,
raise prices, they usually don't turn around and say we'd actually like a smaller profit margins. But Americans are beginning to become aware of the fact that
yeah.
companies are getting back a very large amount of money. I mean, over $100 billion
But Danny,
is
where's that money going to come from? I guess a lot of people wondering where is 166 billion going to come from. The White House is big, but they don't have sofas where they have that much change down the back of them, right?
It's exactly right. It's not as if the government has $166 billion sort of in the couch cushions. But, broadly speaking, this tariff is a tax. President Trump has not called it that, but that's what it is in effect. And that tax gets lumped in with income tax, with corporate tax, and it all sits with the Treasury. So the government has this money. The question that trade experts are trying to understand now is, did the Trump administration set this money aside, that the tariff revenue they collected, in case they would have to pay it back? Or has some of it already been spent? So that's the question that we don't really have an answer to yet, right?
Hmm.
Is there just $166 billion on the side waiting to see what happens? Or will the government have to draw from other pots of money to cover these refunds?
Okay, politically, how does this play out for Donald Trump? He's dealing with a war on the other side of the world. He's got some midterms coming up later this year. How is this going to affect him as the year progresses?
Well, this has been a big political blow, a big defeat for him. There's no question about it. There's no other way to put it. As I said earlier, right? I mean, tariffs were one of the two or three biggest promises he made on the campaign trail when he was running for reelection, that he would put in place this broad, sweeping, unprecedented tariff system that was going to transform the global economy and put the U.S. on an even footing with its rivals and trade partners and so on. That is now partly out the window. The Supreme Court ruling struck that down. The administration has kept some tariffs in place, but they've had to make them more narrow to comply with the law. So he lost the ability, on the one hand, to put these broad tariff system in place. And then on the other hand, now, sort of adding insult to injury, if you will, has to pay back all of this money. So it just complicates President Trump's case. And of course, he's not on the ballot in November, but by extension, it complicates the case for Republicans to make to voters to say, hey, 2 years in, a year and a half into Trump's second term,
Yeah,
we are strong stewards of the economy, because a central part of their economic message
yeah.
has now been undercut or pulled out from under them.
Have these tariffs made life better for Americans or worse? He talked about Liberation Day, as you mentioned. He talked about winning, 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 winning. Are Americans winning?
The short answer in the last year probably is no, right? Because from the cost of TVs to wood at the lumber store to grocery stores to clothing and so on, costs have gone up in general. And Trump promised to lower inflation from the Biden years. Inflation has, roughly stayed the same. It hasn't gone appreciably down. As we've talked about, companies pass those costs on to consumers. That probably won't go away. So in the short term, the answer is no. Had these tariffs stayed in place, had the Supreme Court not struck them down, then we'd be talking about a sort of several-year process to see how would it have actually impacted the economy in the long run. The Trump administration has argued that that in the long run, this will be better for the US. We're not going to know that answer because those tariffs are out the window. And so the short term answer is this has been a cost, a burden for consumers. And we know from public polling that these tariffs have not been popular. So that's sort of the answer from the public on one of Trump's core economic issues.
Thank you so much for your time, Daniel. That's Daniel Bush, our Washington correspondent. And do click on the link below if you want more from the Global News Podcast. Thank you so much for your company. We'll see you on the next one.